I assume I helped an alien escape, and he showed me the Ethiopian Bible's hidden prophecy of Jesus. I need you to understand something before I tell you what happened in those highlands. I was never a man who be. That streak of light tearing across the Ethiopian sky like a sword unsheathed from heaven itself, silent at first, then roaring with a sound that shook the ancient mountains beneath my feet. I had been walking the pilgrimage route my grandfather walked, the path worn smooth by centuries of faithful feet seeking something greater than themselves, when the heavens opened and something divine, or so I thought, came crashing down into the valley below. The impact sent birds scattering like prayers released into the wind, and the earth itself seemed to hold its breath. I should have turned back. I should have run toward the safety of the monastery where I had spent the night, but something deeper than instinct pulled me forward, something that felt like a hand on my shoulder, guiding me toward a destiny I had been walking toward my entire life without knowing it. The smoke rose in a perfect pillar, straight and unwavering, and I remembered the scriptures about God leading his people through the wilderness with a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. My heart was hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape my chest, but my feet kept moving, drawn by a force I can only describe as holy compulsion, the kind that makes prophets climb mountains and fishermen abandon their nets. When I reached the crash site, the world became something else entirely. Something that existed between the pages of scripture and the edge of human understanding. A place where the veil between heaven and earth had grown thin enough to touch. The ground was scorched in a perfect circle. The grass burned away to reveal ancient stone beneath, stone carved with symbols I recognized from the old church, crosses and stars, intertwined in patterns that suddenly seemed less like decoration and more like a map. At the center of this sacred geometry lay something that defied every category my mind tried to force upon it. A vessel, crystalline and pulsing with inner light, shaped like a teardrop, or perhaps like a prayer taking physical form. Through its translucent walls I could see him, and I knew immediately it was a him, though nothing about his form resembled the men I had known in my village. His body was elongated, graceful, wrapped in what looked like woven light, and his face, his face was beautiful in a way that hurt to witness, the kind of beauty that makes you understand why angels in the Bible always begin their messages with "Do not be afraid." His eyes found mine through the crystalline barrier, and in them I saw such depths of sorrow and wisdom that I fell to my knees without deciding to fall. Those eyes held centuries, perhaps millennia, and they looked at me not with the cold curiosity I expected from something not of this world, but with desperate hope, with recognition, as if he had been searching for me across vast distances of space and time. The vessel was cracked, leaking some kind of luminescent fluid that evaporated into symbols before disappearing, and I could feel a thrumming in my bones, a vibration that seemed to carry meaning beyond words, like the resonance of a church bell that speaks directly to the soul. His hand pressed against the interior wall, long fingers splayed, and without thinking I pressed my own hand to the outside, matching his gesture palm to palm with only that barrier between us. The moment we connected, even through that crystalline surface, warmth flooded through me, a warmth that started in my hand and rushed up my arm and exploded in my chest, like the feeling of being forgiven, like the moment you realize you are loved beyond measure and reason. And then I heard them, the drones, mechanical locusts buzzing in the distance, their sound wrong and harsh against the sacred silence of the highlands, growing louder. With every heartbeat, I looked into his ancient eyes and saw what was coming: capture, dissection, the reduction of mystery to data, the translation of wonder into weapon. Something in me made a choice before my conscious mind could interfere, something that felt like it came from a part of my soul I had never accessed before, the part that was made in the image of a God who breaks chains and opens prison doors. I grabbed a stone, one of the ancient marked stones that ringed the vessel, and I began to strike the crystalline surface where the cracks had already begun, each blow a prayer, each impact a declaration that some things are too sacred to be caged by the fearful and the small-minded. The pod shattered like a cathedral window, struck by light, fragmenting into 1,000 pieces that dissolved before hitting the ground, becoming mist, becoming nothing, and he spilled forward into my arms with unexpected weight and warmth, more solid and real than anything I had ever held. He was dying. I could feel it in the way his body trembled, in the cooling of his skin that moments before had been burning with inner fire, but his hand reached up and touched my forehead with 2 fingers, gentle as a blessing, and the world exploded into meaning. I didn't hear words. I experienced them, felt them written directly onto my consciousness in a language older than Amharic, older than Ge'ez, older perhaps than human speech itself. I have been waiting for you across centuries. The meaning flooded through me, and I understood with terrible clarity that this moment, this meeting in the burned highlands at dawn, with military forces closing in, was not an accident or an invasion, but an appointment kept, a promise fulfilled. The beginning of an answer to questions I had been asking God my entire life without knowing how to form the words. He pulled himself to his feet with strength that seemed to come from pure will, his eyes locked on mine with an intensity that made me feel seen for the first time. Truly seen, not as a simple pilgrim or a village son, but as something chosen, prepared, necessary to a plan so vast it made my knees weak to glimpse even the edge of it. He gripped my shoulder with surprising strength for someone who moments ago seemed on the edge of death, and together we ran through the highland brush as the drones screamed overhead like metallic demons searching for what they could not understand. My lungs burned with the thin mountain air. My feet stumbled over roots and stones that my ancestors had walked across in their own journeys toward divine encounter, but his hand steadied me, guided me, and I felt a strange reversal occurring. I who had freed him was now being led. I who had thought myself the rescuer was discovering I was the one being saved from a smaller understanding of what God's creation actually contained. The sun was rising properly now, spilling golden light across the valleys and peaks, and in that light his skin seemed to shimmer with patterns that reminded me of the illuminated manuscripts in the monastery library, texts copied by faithful hands that somehow knew to preserve images of beings with wings and wheels covered in eyes, beings that Scripture called messengers, but that we had reduced to greeting card sentiments with harps and halos. He pulled me behind an outcropping of rock, just as a drone passed so close I could feel the wind from its rotors, and we pressed ourselves against the ancient stone, breathing hard. And I realized that his breath came in the same desperate rhythm as mine, that whatever else he was alive in ways that made the word alien feel like a grotesque inadequacy, a failure of language to capture the truth of what knelt beside me in the dirt and light of an Ethiopian morning. When the drones impassed, hunting in the wrong direction with their blind mechanical certainty, he turned to me and placed both hands on either side of my face, cradling my head with a gentleness that reminded me of how my mother used to hold me when I was feverish as a child, when the boundary between sleep and waking grew thin, and I would see strange, beautiful things in the darkness. His eyes were so close to mine that I could see galaxies in them. I mean that literally, not poetically. I could see stars wheeling in the depths of those impossible irises. Constellations I recognized from childhood nights, spent on my grandfather's roof, learning the names of lights that had traveled years to reach my retina. And constellations I had never seen, patterns that belonged to skies viewed from worlds I could not name. Do not be afraid, the meaning poured into me, not through ears, but through every cell, and I almost laughed, because those were the exact words the angel spoke to Mary, the exact words spoken at every threshold moment when heaven breaks into the ordinary world, and transforms it into the stage for God's impossible interventions. Your faith has prepared you for this knowledge, he communicated, and I felt tears streaming down my face, because I understood he wasn't speaking of faith as intellectual assent to doctrines, but faith as the deep soul, readiness to have everything you thought you knew shattered and rebuilt into something larger, more true, more reflective of a God whose love refuses the small containers we try to store it in. I am called Sariel among my kind, and I have walked your earth since the days when the Word became flesh and dwelt among you. And what I have witnessed, what I have been commanded to preserve and protect until the appointed time, will show you that the story you know is true, but so much vaster than the borders your councils and creeds have drawn around it. The military vehicles were audible now in the distance, engines growling as they climbed the mountain roads, men with guns and classifications coming to capture what they would label a threat, to dissect what they should worship, and I knew with crystal certainty that we had minutes at best before this moment of revelation would be interrupted by the fear and violence that humanity deploys against anything that challenges our illusion of centrality and control. Sariel released my face, but took my hand, his grip firm and warm and utterly alive, and he began leading me up a narrow path I had never noticed before, a trail that seemed to appear between one heartbeat and the next, stones arranged in a pattern that was too deliberate to be natural, but too ancient to be recent. There is a place. His meaning flowed into me as we climbed, stumbling upward toward a cliff face that looked solid and impassable, where one of your faithful made sanctuary for my kind before, in a time when emperors sought power through our technology and wisdom, in a time when a monk named Abagarima understood that some knowledge must be hidden until the world is ready to hold it, without weaponizing it, without using it to divide rather than unite the children of the Most High. As we approached what appeared to be blank rock, he reached out and touched the stone with his palm, and light spread from the contact point like water soaking into fabric, revealing symbols that glowed briefly before the rock itself sighed open, an ancient door responding to an ancient key. And I glimpsed darkness beyond that somehow felt safer than the dawn we were leaving behind. We stumbled into the cave, and the entrance sealed behind us with a sound like an exhale, plunging us into blackness for only a moment before Sariel himself began to glow, soft bioluminescence spreading across his skin in patterns that I now recognized as language, as meaning made visible, as the physical manifestation of words that carried weight and truth in their very structure. As my eyes adjusted, I gasped audibly because the walls around us were covered floor to ceiling with images and texts, star charts overlaid with scripture passages in gaze, so ancient the dialect was almost unrecognizable, diagrams of the cosmos with Earth, not at the center, but not insignificant either, rather positioned as a crucial junction point, a hinge upon which vast doors of redemption could swing open to encompass realities I had no framework to comprehend. A monk sheltered me here 900 years ago, Sariel communicated, gesturing to the walls with something like reverence in his posture, when I was wounded by those of my own kind who had fallen into the ancient rebellion, who sought to prevent humanity from receiving the fullness of what the incarnation meant not just for your species, but for all conscious beings throughout the expanse of creation. I moved closer to the walls, my hands shaking as I reached toward inscriptions that seemed to pulse with their own light, and I saw my own language intertwined with symbols that belonged to no human alphabet, saw depictions of the cross surrounded by what could only be described as spacecraft or perhaps the Merkava that Ezekiel tried to describe with the limited vocabulary of a man who had never seen anything more advanced than a cart with wheels. "What is this place?" I whispered aloud, my voice strange and small in the sacred darkness, and Sariel's response flooded through me with the weight of revealed mystery. "This is the bridge your people kept intact when others burned and edited and reduced the story to fit their politics and fears. This is why Ethiopia matters in ways that empires never understood, why the Ark itself was entrusted here, why the complete Book of Enoch survived in your keeping when it was stripped from other canons. You were chosen as stewards of the full truth, guardians of the knowledge that God's plan has always been cosmic in scope, that the salvation story is so much bigger and more beautiful than one planet's redemption, though it begins and pivots here, on this exact soil, in the exact moment when eternity put on flesh and entered the stream of linear time to transform it from within. I moved along the cave wall, like a pilgrim tracing the stations of the cross, my fingertips hovering just above the surface of inscriptions that seemed to breathe with their own luminescence, and I began to recognize fragments of texts I had memorized as a child in the Orthodox Church, where my grandmother brought me every Sunday before dawn. But here, those familiar words were interwoven with passages I had never encountered. Verses that read like missing pieces of a puzzle I had not known was incomplete, and my heart hammered against my ribs as I understood that what I was seeing was not contradiction, but completion, not heresy, but the full revelation that had been carefully preserved in this highland sanctuary, while the rest of the Christian world argued over which books to keep and which to bury. Sariel moved beside me, his presence both alien and somehow deeply familiar, and he gestured toward a section of wall where the Ge'ez script glowed brighter than the rest, arranged in columns that framed an image of a figure with arms outstretched, surrounded by concentric circles that could have been either ancient cosmological diagrams or a modern physicist's rendering of dimensional layers collapsing into a single point of infinite density and infinite love. Abba Garima understood what many of your theologians forgot. The meaning poured into my consciousness like warm oil, like anointing that the prophets saw truly when they described the Holy One as dwelling not just above the earth but throughout the vast expanse, that when your scriptures speak of God creating countless worlds, it was not metaphor but literal truth, and that the beings you call angels are not the only conscious creatures the Almighty brought forth from the divine imagination. My eyes locked onto a passage from Enoch that I recognized from the Ethiopian Bible. My grandfather had kept wrapped in cloth, treated with the reverence others reserved for relics, and I began to read aloud in a whisper, the ancient words feeling new and urgent on my tongue. And I saw in those days how long cords were given to those angels, and they took to themselves wings, and flew, and they went towards the north. And I asked the angel, saying unto him, Why have those angels taken these cords and gone off? And he said unto me, They have gone to measure. Sariel's hand touched my shoulder, and suddenly I was no longer simply reading, but experiencing, no longer observing text, but inhabiting vision. And I saw as Enoch must have seen, felt the tearing open of normal perception to reveal the scaffolding of creation itself, the vast architecture of reality that extends beyond the visible spectrum into frequencies and dimensions that human eyes were not designed to process, but human souls were always meant to comprehend. I saw beings of light moving through the cosmos with purpose and intentionality, measuring and tending and observing, and I understood with a clarity that bypassed all doubt that these were the watchers, the ones assigned to witness and record, to serve as the eyes and hands of divine providence, as it worked out the great story of reconciliation across distances that reduced our galaxy to a single pixel in an image too large for any created mind to hold in its entirety. We were sent to watch and wait, Sariel communicated, and I felt sorrow in the transmission, ancient grief carried across centuries. And some of us fell into the same pride that corrupted the first rebels, believing that our knowledge and power made us equal to the one who sent us, believing we could improve upon the plan or abandon our posts or interfere in ways that served our curiosity rather than the divine purpose. The vision released me, and I staggered backward, gasping for air, my mind struggling to expand enough to contain what I had just witnessed, and Sariel steadied me with a gentleness that spoke of deep compassion, of someone who had watched humanity for so long that our fragility had become precious to him rather than contemptible. He guided me to sit on a smooth stone that looked like it had been placed there intentionally, perhaps by the monk who had created this sanctuary, perhaps by older hands still, and as I sat trying to remember how to breathe normally, he knelt before me so that his luminous eyes were level with mine, and in their depths I saw not just stars, but suffering, not just cosmic vastness, but intimate acquaintance with loss and longing, and the terrible weight of knowledge that cannot be shared until the appointed time. The monk who sheltered me understood something that your modern world has forgotten in its rush to separate science from spirit, to build walls between the laboratory and the sanctuary. Sariel's meaning flowed into me with the texture of gentle teaching, a patient instructor helping a struggling student grasp a concept that would unlock entire fields of understanding. He understood that all truth is God's truth, that the physics governing the stars and the love commanding the soul flow from the same eternal source, that the one who spoke light into existence at the beginning is the same one who became light incarnate to dwell among you, and that these are not competing narratives, but one seamless story of a creator who refuses to abandon what was made, who pursues the lost across every dimension and distance with relentless, unreasonable, transforming grace. I found my voice, though it came out rough and small in the glowing darkness. Why are you showing me this? Why here? Why now? Why me? And Sariel's response came with a weight that felt like ordination, like commissioning, like the terrifying call that came to prophets who never sought the burden of carrying messages too large for human mouths. Because the time of separation is ending, because humanity stands at a threshold where you will soon discover you are not alone in the cosmos. And when that discovery comes, it will either destroy your faith or expand it into something more true, more reflective of the God who is actually there, rather than the small deities your fears and prejudices have constructed. He rose to his feet and moved to the deepest part of the cave, where a stone altar stood, and upon it rested a book, not ancient and crumbling as I expected, but somehow pristine, as if it existed slightly outside the normal flow of time that decays and diminishes all things material. The Book of Enoch that your people preserved is more complete than even your scholars realize, he communicated, gesturing for me to approach, and there are passages here that speak directly to this moment, to the revelation that Christ came not only as the Son of Man, but as the reconciler of all things, the hinge upon which the fate of every conscious being throughout creation swings toward either final rebellion or eternal restoration. I approached the altar with trembling legs, with the sensation of standing on holy ground, and as I looked down at the open pages, the text began to glow with the same otherworldly light that pulsed through Sariel's form, and I knew I was about to understand something that would shatter and remake everything I thought I knew about the cross, the cosmos, and the incomprehensible love that holds them both in existence. I stood before the altar as Sariel's form cast prismatic shadows across the ancient stone, and his voice, no, not voice, but the direct transmission of meaning that bypassed sound entirely, began to unfold a history I had never imagined, a testimony that rewrote my understanding of angels and aliens, of scripture and stars, of the vast patient work of God across distances that made our sun look like a grain of sand on an infinite shore. I am called Sariel, which in your Hebrew means command of God, and I am one of the watchers, those beings your prophet Enoch described with such precision that later generations assumed his words were metaphor or mythology rather than eyewitness testimony. The meaning poured into my consciousness like sacred oil, anointing and illuminating simultaneously. We were sent to observe humanity from the beginning, to witness and record, to serve as the eyes of heaven upon the unfolding drama of your species as you walked the long road from dust to divine image, from chaos to covenant, from exile to the possibility of return. I gripped the edge of the altar to steady myself as waves of implication crashed over me, as my mind struggled to reconcile the being standing before me with everything I had been taught about the nature of spiritual reality. And yet, somehow the presence of this alien creature did not diminish my faith, but rather expanded it into dimensions I had never known existed, like a child who believed the sky was a blue ceiling, suddenly understanding the vast atmosphere, and beyond it, the infinite deep, where stars are born and die in cycles of cosmic liturgy. You have been watching us since the beginning? I managed to whisper, and Sariel inclined his luminous head in acknowledgement, a gesture so human and yet performed by something so clearly other that the juxtaposition sent shivers down my spine. We were present in the garden, though unseen, and we witnessed the fracture that your theologians call the fall, the moment when humanity chose the illusion of autonomy over the reality of relationship, and we wept. Yes, we are capable of sorrow, because we knew what it would cost the Creator to repair what had been broken, Sariel communicated, and I saw in the depths of his eyes something like tears, a crystalline moisture that caught the cave's strange light and refracted it into colors I had no names for. We observed the flood and the tower, the patriarchs and the Exodus, the judges and the kings, and we recorded everything in archives that exist in places your physics has not yet learned to describe, dimensions that intersect with yours, but remain hidden until consciousness reaches the frequency required to perceive them. He moved around the altar with a grace that seemed to ignore gravity's full claim, and as he moved, the light within him pulsed in rhythms that reminded me of a heartbeat, of something alive and vulnerable, despite the obvious power contained in his form. But our mission changed when we received word that the Creator himself would enter your world, would take on the limitations of human flesh, would submit to birth and death and all the indignities that matter imposes upon spirit. And now his communication carried a weight of awe that transcended species, a reverence so profound that I knew I was in the presence of a being who understood worship in ways that made my Sunday morning liturgies look like a child's first attempts at speech. We did not understand why the infinite would compress itself into the finite, why the eternal would agree to experience time's arrow, why the one who spoke galaxies into existence would consent to the vulnerability of an infant's body in a backwater province of a minor empire on an unremarkable planet circling an average star, Sariel continued, and I felt my throat tighten with emotion as I recognized that this cosmic being was describing the incarnation with the same wonder and confusion that must have gripped the shepherds and the magi, the same holy bewilderment that marks every genuine encounter with the scandal of divine humility. Ethiopia was chosen as a guardian of truth long before your European councils decided which books belonged in Scripture and which should be hidden away. Sariel gestured toward the glowing walls where Gaia's characters seemed to dance in the flickering light, and I understood that I was standing in a library more significant than Alexandria, a repository of revelation that had been preserved through centuries of war and invasion and the slow erosion of memory that threatens all human institutions. Abba Garima, the monk who sheltered me when my vessel was damaged during what your historians call the 6th century, understood that the Book of Enoch was not apocryphal fancy, but essential testimony, that its descriptions of heavenly councils and cosmic geography were not primitive superstition, but accurate reporting of realities that most humans cannot perceive without assistance. And as he spoke, I remembered my grandfather's insistence that our Ethiopian Bible contained truths the rest of Christianity had lost. remembered how he would run his weathered fingers across the pages and whisper that we were keepers of something precious, custodians of mysteries that would matter when the world was finally ready to receive them. The passages about the Watchers were preserved here because your people understood instinctively what others forgot, that God's creation extends far beyond your planet's atmosphere, that the divine imagination brought forth countless forms of conscious life across the vast expanse, and that the story of redemption is larger than any single world's salvation, though what happened on this world became the pivot point for everything else. Sariel's meaning flowed with the authority of lived experience, of someone who had witnessed history from perspectives I could barely conceive. When Enoch wrote of beings descending from heaven, of angels who walked among humans and taught them mysteries, he was not fabricating legends. He was documenting encounters like the one you and I are having now, contact between human consciousness and forms of life that evolved or were created under distant suns, all of us part of the same cosmic story, authored by the same loving intelligence who knows every sparrow's fall and numbers every hair on every head across all the worlds that cry out to him in languages your ears were not designed to hear. But why was this hidden? I asked, my voice breaking with the weight of implications. I was only beginning to grasp the sense that everything I thought I knew about my faith was not wrong, but desperately incomplete. Like reading only every 10th page of a novel and thinking you understood the plot. Not hidden, preserved, Sariel corrected gently, moving to stand beside me so that we both faced the altar and the glowing text that lay open upon it, an arrangement that felt less like interrogation and more like collaboration. Two students standing before a mystery, too large for either to comprehend alone. The councils that assembled your biblical canon operated with the knowledge available to them, making decisions they believed honored God, but they could not include what they themselves did not fully understand, could not affirm testimonies about cosmic scope when their cosmology extended only as far as the celestial spheres they imagined rotating above the earth. His communication carried no judgment, only the patience of one who has learned that truth unfolds according to readiness, that revelation respects the limits of what each generation can bear. Ethiopia maintained these texts because your spiritual ancestors possessed a wisdom that came not from philosophy, but from the deep wells of mystical knowing, from that direct encounter with the divine that bypasses human logic and speaks soul to soul, spirit to spirit. And as he said this, I felt a surge of pride for my people, for the monks and scribes who had guarded these words through persecution and poverty, through colonization and contempt from those who assumed European Christianity represented the complete and final form of faith. You were chosen as keepers because the time would come, this time, your time, when humanity would reach for the stars with your hands and discover that you have neighbors, that you are not alone, and in that moment of contact, you would need a theological framework large enough to hold both your ancient faith and your expanding knowledge, a way to understand that the God of Abraham and Moses and Jesus is also the God of galaxies beyond counting, of creatures whose prayers rise in frequencies you cannot hear, but which are no less precious to the one who hears and answers according to wisdom that comprehends all things at once. Sariel moved to the ancient altar with deliberate grace, his luminous fingers hovering above the opened book of Enoch, and as he did, the Ge'ez script began to glow with an otherworldly radiance that transformed the cave into something between a sanctuary and an observatory, each letter pulsing with light that seemed to breathe in rhythm with my own thundering heart. The passages preserved here contain prophecies that your wider Christian world dismissed as Jewish mysticism, as intertestamental curiosities, too strange to include in the authorized canon. But what they actually contain is the cosmic context for the incarnation, the universal framework that explains why the birth in Bethlehem sent shockwaves across dimensions. Your scientists are only beginning to theorize. His meaning poured into my consciousness as his hand passed over the text, and the glowing letters seemed to lift from the page, hovering in the air between us like constellations, rearranging themselves into a message written in light itself. I watched in breathless wonder as the words transformed before my eyes, and though I could read gaze as my grandfather had taught me, these characters now carried layers of meaning I had never perceived, as if the text had always contained multidimensional truth that required a watcher's presence to unlock, frequencies of revelation that human eyes alone could not detect without help from one who existed partially outside our limited spectrum of perception. Read here, the 62nd chapter, where Enoch records what he was shown about the righteous one who would come, but read it now with understanding of what righteous means in the cosmic vocabulary. Not merely moral goodness, but the one who would restore right relationship, right alignment, right harmony across all the fractured dimensions of creation. Sariel's communication guided my attention to specific verses that now blazed with particular intensity, and I leaned forward, my lips moving as I read the ancient words that suddenly felt urgently contemporary, breathtakingly relevant to this impossible moment. And I saw in those days how long cords were given to those angels, and they took to themselves wings and flew, and they went towards the north, I read aloud, my voice trembling, as the glowing text seemed to respond to my spoken words, brightening and dimming like a living thing, acknowledging its own utterance. Your Enoch saw our vessels, understood them as angels, because his vocabulary contained no word for spacecraft, no concept for technology that appears as magic to those who have not yet discovered its principles. And yet his description is remarkably accurate if you understand that angels and what you call aliens are not separate categories, but overlapping realities, different facets of the same creative intention that brought forth conscious beings in countless forms across the vast estate of God's imagination, Sariel explained, and I felt my mind stretching, expanding, making room for a cosmology so much larger than the neat categories I had been taught in Sunday school. Yet somehow this expansion felt not like contradiction, but like fulfillment, like finally seeing the full picture after squinting at a tiny fragment my whole life. And he showed me the angels of punishment who are prepared to come and let loose all the powers of the waters which are beneath in the earth in order to bring judgment and destruction. I continued reading, and Sariel nodded, that gesture of acknowledgement that felt both familiar and alien, human and other. The waters beneath the earth, the powers that sustain and threaten, Enoch perceived. Spiritual realities that govern physical laws, the angelic intelligences that your modern mind would call forces of nature, but which are actually conscious expressions of divine order, beings or principles or something between the two that maintain the structures allowing matter to cohere and life to flourish. And as he spoke, I remembered my physics classes, remembered learning about fundamental forces and quantum fields, and suddenly wondered if those impersonal equations were actually describing personal presences, if the universe was far more alive than materialism had taught me to believe. But read here the most crucial passage, the one that changes everything, Sariel's urgency intensified as he directed me to chapter 48, where the text glowed so brightly I had to shield my eyes momentarily. And when I adjusted to the radiance, I saw the words that would haunt me forever. And in that hour that Son of Man was named in the presence of the Lord of Spirits, and his name before the Head of Days. The meaning crashed over me like a wave of liquid light as Sariel's consciousness merged partially with my own, showing me what my human perception alone could not grasp, that before the incarnation in time, there was a naming in eternity. A cosmic announcement that rippled across every dimension where conscious beings dwelt, alerting countless worlds that the Reconciler was being prepared, that the fracture in creation would soon receive its healer, and I wept without fully understanding why, tears streaming down my face as I felt the magnitude of something so vast that my heart could barely contain it. "You see it now, don't you?" Sariel's voice was gentle, almost tender, as he watched my reaction. "You begin to comprehend that the child born in Bethlehem was not a local deity, not a tribal god choosing favorites, but the answer to a cosmic equation that had been unbalanced since the first rebellion, since the fracture that your scripture calls the fall, but which echoed across galaxies you cannot see, affecting beings you have never imagined." I nodded, unable to speak, my throat tight with emotion as the glowing text seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat, and Sariel moved his hand in a fluid gesture that caused the air itself to shimmer and fold, reality bending like fabric as he whispered, "Let me show you what the faithful across the stars witnessed on that night. Your world calls holy." The cave dissolved around us, or rather we dissolved through it, my body somehow remaining in place, while my consciousness expanded outward. And suddenly, I was no longer standing on stone, but floating in the absolute silence of space, suspended in darkness so complete that it should have terrified me, but instead felt like being held in the palm of an infinite hand, cradled in a vast tenderness that knew my name before I was born. Below me, impossibly beautiful and fragile, turned the blue and white sphere of Earth, and I recognized the curved edge of Africa, the northeastern highlands where my own village lay invisible beneath swirling clouds, and the sight of my homeworld from this impossible vantage point made me gasp with wonder and grief, overwhelmed by how small and precious it appeared against the endless void. This is how we saw it. Sariel's presence remained beside me, though we had no bodies here. Only awareness, only perception tuned to frequencies beyond flesh and bone. On that night, when the star appeared, when the convergence aligned, we were scattered across this region of space, dozens of vessels holding representatives from worlds you have no names for, all of us drawn by the prophecy that had been encoded in the ancient texts, in the DNA of reality itself, all of us watching to see if the promise would truly be fulfilled. I turned my attention to where he directed, and my breath caught as I saw them, lights that were not stars, hovering at various distances from Earth, some closer than the moon, others far beyond Mars. A silent assembly of witnesses positioned like worshippers around an altar, each vessel distinct in shape and size, some crystalline like Sariel's, and craft, others organic and flowing, still others geometric and precise, a diversity of forms that spoke of a universe far more populated and intentional than I had ever imagined. We had been waiting for generations, some of us for thousands of your years, because the prophecy was specific about the timing, about the convergence of political conditions and spiritual readiness, about the moment when heaven would pierce earth in the most vulnerable way possible, not as conquering force, but as infant child. And that paradox itself was the proof we needed, the evidence that this was truly the Creator's methodology, and not another pretender's claim to cosmic significance. Sariel's explanation washed over me as I watched the scene unfold. Time somehow compressed and expanded simultaneously, and I saw the star that was not a star blazing into existence, a brilliant point of light that pulsed with colors no human eye had names for, frequencies of radiance that carried information as well as illumination, broadcasting across dimensions that the moment had arrived, the promise was being kept. The reconciler had entered the world. I witnessed ships drawing closer, maintaining careful distance to avoid disrupting human affairs, but positioned to observe, to record, to testify across their own worlds that they had seen the fulfillment. And I understood with sudden clarity why the shepherds had seen angels in the sky, why the Magi had followed celestial guidance, because the veil between dimensions had grown thin that night, translucent with holy purpose, allowing those with eyes to see to glimpse the cosmic significance of what was occurring in a small cave, in an occupied territory, on a minor planet in an unremarkable galaxy. "Look now, look at the moment," Sariel urged, and my awareness focused on Bethlehem, on a specific stable where a young woman cradled a newborn against her chest. And though I could not see details from this orbital perspective, I felt rather than saw the shockwave that emanated from that exact location, a pulse of light that expanded in all directions simultaneously, passing through matter and space and time itself, washing over the assembled vessels with such power that I saw them rock and stabilize, saw their lights flicker and brighten in response, and I heard, impossibly heard across the vacuum of space, a sound like 10,000 choirs singing in languages I did not know but somehow understood. A unified cry of recognition and relief and triumphant joy. Every being in those ships felt it. The shift in reality's fundamental frequency, the restoration of a harmony that had been disrupted before your ancestors walked upright. And we knew, all of us knew, regardless of our different theologies and understandings, that something essential had just changed in the fabric of creation itself, that a door had been opened that no force in any dimension could shut again, that redemption had become possible in a way it had never been before. Sariel's voice carried emotion I had not heard from him until now, something that sounded almost like longing, like the ache of one who stands outside a warm house on a winter night, seeing the light through windows, but uncertain of his welcome. I wanted to speak, to ask if that redemption extended to him, to the watchers, to all the beings assembled in that ancient vigil. But before I could form the question, the vision shifted again, and I saw the years accelerating, saw the child grow, saw the ministry begin, saw crowds and miracles and confrontations, saw the terrible crescendo of crucifixion, and then, oh God, then I saw the resurrection morning, and the light that had pulsed at the Nativity exploded outward with such force that it crossed galaxies in an instant, a tsunami of luminous grace that swept through the assembled vessels and beyond them, racing toward distant stars, toward worlds I would never visit, carrying the message that death itself had been defeated, that the fracture was being healed, that every being in every dimension now had access to the reconciliation that had been purchased at such devastating cost. I was weeping uncontrollably now, my consciousness flooding with joy and sorrow intermingled, understanding for the first time that the story I had grown up with was not smaller than I thought, but infinitely larger, not diminished by this cosmic context, but glorified by it, revealed as the central drama of universal history, rather than a local religious tale. And I loved Jesus more in that moment than I ever had before. Loved him with a fierce gratitude that he had been willing to become so small, so vulnerable, so localized in order to accomplish something so impossibly vast. The vision held me suspended in that impossible space between stars and understanding, and I felt Sariel's presence shift beside me, his attention drawing mine toward something new, something that made the air itself seem to tremble with anticipation. The resurrection was not merely a reversal of death, not simply a man returning to life as your scriptures sometimes make it sound, he said, his voice carrying layers of meaning that my mind struggled to process even as my heart opened to receive them. It was a cosmic reset, a fundamental restructuring of the laws that had governed existence since the first rebellion, and its effects rippled outward from that garden tomb with such force that every dimension, every realm, every shadowed corner of creation felt its impact simultaneously. As he spoke, I saw it, witnessed what no human eye had ever been positioned to see, the moment when Christ emerged from death, not as a localized miracle, but as a detonation of divine light that cascaded through realities I had no framework to comprehend. illuminating regions of existence that had been shrouded in darkness since before Earth's foundation, reaching beings who had been trapped in cycles of despair and separation for epochs beyond human counting. The wave of light moved like liquid gold mixed with lightning, beautiful and terrible in its purity, and wherever it touched, I saw chains dissolving, saw dimensional barriers cracking open, saw beings of 1,000 different forms lifting their faces toward a hope they had thought forever extinguished. And I understood with stunning clarity that the redemption purchased on Calvary had not been limited by geography or species, or even the boundaries of what we consider physical reality. There are beings, human child, who fell long before your kind took your first breath, who made choices in epochs when your sun was still coalescing from cosmic dust, and they have lived with the consequences of those choices for so long that they had forgotten what grace even meant, forgotten that restoration was possible, resigned themselves to an eternity of exile from the light they once knew. Sariel continued, and I heard in his voice something raw and personal, a wound that had not fully healed despite the passage of ages. I watched as the resurrection light touched worlds I could not name, saw it penetrate strongholds of darkness where beings twisted by eons of separation from their Creator suddenly felt the first tremor of possibility, the first whisper that perhaps their story was not finished, that the bridge had been built, and the invitation extended even to those who had thought themselves beyond redemption's reach. Did it reach everyone? Did every fallen being accept it? I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper against the immensity of what I was witnessing, and Sariel's response carried a sorrow that made my chest ache with sympathetic pain. No, some refused even then. Some clung to their rebellion with such ferocity that they turned away from the very light that could have healed them, choosing the familiar agony of separation over the vulnerable humility of return. And that choice, that terrible freedom, was honored even by the one who wept over their refusal, he said, and I saw it, saw beings of magnificent power and ancient pride deliberately shielding themselves from the resurrection wave. Saw them retreat deeper into darkness, not because they were denied access, but because accepting it would require admitting they had been wrong, would demand the death of the false selves they had constructed over millennia of isolation. But I also saw the others, the ones who had been waiting without knowing what they waited for, whose rebellion had been born of confusion rather than malice, who had spent ages in anguish over choices made in moments of cosmic crisis they barely understood, and when the light reached them, I saw their transformation, saw them fall to whatever limbs or appendages they possessed, saw them weep with relief so profound it seemed to shake the foundations of their dimensional prisons, saw them begin the long journey home that the cross had made possible. Sariel, I breathed, turning my awareness toward him with a question I was almost afraid to ask. Did you accept it? Did the Watchers who were assigned to Earth, who fell in love with humanity and broke the boundaries set for them, did you feel this light and let it transform you? The silence that followed seemed to stretch across light years, heavy with implications I could barely grasp, and when he finally answered, his voice carried a complexity of emotion that transcended any single human word. Some of us did. Some reached toward that light with every fragment of our fractured beings and felt the chains of our exile begin to loosen, felt the possibility of restoration, even though the full completion of that restoration remains a mystery. We walked toward with trembling hope, he said, and I understood that I was speaking with a being in process, neither fully fallen nor fully redeemed, existing in the tension between what he had been and what he might yet become. And that tension itself was a testimony to the far-reaching implications of Christ's victory. But others of my kind refused, clung to their old powers and privileges, to their claims of superior knowledge and ancient rights. And they remain in rebellion even now, working against the reconciliation because admitting they need it would shatter the carefully constructed identities they have maintained since before your prophets wrote the first scriptures, he added, and I heard both grief and warning in his tone, a reminder that the cosmic war was not yet finished, even though its ultimate outcome had been decided on a hill outside Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. I felt myself being drawn back then, consciousness returning to the cave where my physical body still stood, and as reality solidified around me once more, I found I was on my knees, face wet with tears I had not known I was crying, hands pressed against the stone floor as if anchoring myself to something solid after being untethered from every certainty I had ever known. Sariel stood before me, his form seeming both more alien and more familiar than before, and I saw in his ancient eyes a vulnerability I had not perceived earlier, a question unasked, but present nonetheless, as if my response to what he had shown me mattered in ways that extended beyond this moment, beyond this cave, into futures I could not yet imagine. The message you are being asked to carry is not that Earth is insignificant, but that it is far more significant than you dreamed, the stage upon which the central drama of cosmic redemption was enacted. The place where the Creator chose to demonstrate his methodology for healing all that had been broken since the first fracture, he said, his hand gesturing toward the glowing manuscript fragments that still pulsed with otherworldly light on. The cave wall. And the message is also this, that no being anywhere in creation is beyond the reach of the light that blazed from that empty tomb, that redemption is not a human monopoly, but a universal offer, that God's love is so vast and so persistent that it pursues the lost across dimensions and epochs, never forcing but always inviting, always calling the scattered children home. I nodded, unable to speak, understanding that I had been given a glimpse of the gospel that was both ancient and utterly new, that honored everything my Ethiopian fathers had taught me while exploding it outward into implications that made my head spin and my heart soar, and I knew with absolute certainty that nothing in my life would ever be the same, that I had been marked by this encounter in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. The sound reached us first, a distant rhythmic thunder that made dust drift down from the cave ceiling, and Sariel's head tilted upward with that peculiar stillness that preceded all his movements, his luminous eyes dimming slightly, as if he were seeing through stone and sky simultaneously to assess what approached. "They have found us," he said simply, without panic or surprise, as though he had always known this moment would arrive and had merely been waiting for time to catch up with inevitability. I scrambled to my feet, heart suddenly hammering against my ribs, and moved toward the cave entrance, where dawn light was beginning to paint the Ethiopian highlands in shades of amber and rose. And there, against that beautiful morning sky, I saw them. Black helicopters moving like predatory insects across the horizon, their presence a jarring intrusion of military precision into this sacred space where heaven and earth had been touching. "What will they do to you?" I asked, turning back to find Sariel already moving among the ancient manuscripts, his long fingers tracing symbols that began to glow brighter at his touch, as if he were saying goodbye to old friends who had kept his secrets through long centuries of waiting. "What they have always done to things they fear and cannot control, they will try to contain, to study, to weaponize, to reduce the mystery of the cosmos down to something that fits inside their laboratories and serves their understanding of power," he replied, and there was no bitterness in his voice, only a kind of weary recognition born of having watched humanity repeat these patterns across generations. The sound of the helicopters grew louder, joined now by the grinding of heavy vehicles navigating the rough mountain trails, and I felt panic rising in my throat like bile, the realization crashing over me that I was about to lose this being who had opened my eyes to truths that rendered my entire previous existence small and shadowed by comparison. "I'm not ready," I said, the words bursting from me with childlike honesty. "I don't know enough yet. I don't understand how to carry what you've shown me, how to speak about these things to people who have never stood where I'm standing or seen what I've seen." Sariel turned to face me then, and the expression on his alien features somehow conveyed a tenderness that transcended species, a look that reminded me bizarrely of the way my grandmother used to regard me when I was young and afraid of storms, as if he saw both my present fear and the future courage I would grow into, and believed in the latter more than I believed in it myself. You understand more than you think, more than your conscious mind has yet processed, because truth plants itself not just in your thoughts, but in your bones, in your blood, in the deep places where faith lives beneath the reach of doubt, he said, moving closer until he stood directly before me, and I could feel the subtle energy that radiated from him, like standing near a source of heat you cannot see but know is present. From within his garment he withdrew something that made me gasp, a manuscript fragment no larger than my two hands placed together, but it glowed with that same interior light I had seen illuminating the Book of Enoch passages on the cave wall, pulsing gently as if it possessed its own heartbeat, its own living awareness. This is a fragment from the original text, from the Ethiopian witnesses who recorded not just what they saw with earthly eyes, but what was revealed to them in visions. The ones who understood that the story of salvation was always meant to be cosmic in scope, that the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob was also the God of 10,000 worlds you have no names for, Sariel explained, placing the fragment carefully in my trembling hands. And the moment my skin made contact with it, I felt a warmth spread through my palms and up my arms, accompanied by a clarity of mind that cut through my panic like sunrise, dispelling shadows. You are now a keeper of the bridge between heaven, earth, and the stars, a voice that will speak into the divide that humanity has created between their faith and their expanding knowledge of the universe, reminding them that these were never meant to be separate, that science reveals the mechanisms of the divine artistry, while faith reveals its purpose and meaning, he continued, and his hand rose to rest briefly on my shoulder, the gesture so unexpectedly human that tears sprang to my eyes. Outside, the sound of boots on stone announced that the military forces were beginning their final approach, voices shouting commands in Amharic and English, the organized chaos of men who believed they were in control of a situation they could not possibly comprehend. "What will you tell them about me?" Sariel asked. And I realized it was not concern for himself that prompted the question, but rather a test, a final assessment of whether I had truly understood what these hours in the cave had been teaching me, whether I could be trusted with the bridge I was now being asked to guard. I looked down at the glowing manuscript in my hands, felt its warmth spreading through my chest like courage being transfused directly into my spirit, and when I raised my eyes to meet his ancient gaze, I found my voice steady, grounded in a certainty I had not possessed, even moments before. "I'll tell them I met an angel," I said slowly, choosing my words with care. "Not because you are what they picture when they hear that word, but because you are a messenger, a servant of the Most High, who has been faithful to your calling across centuries when you could have chosen otherwise, and because the truth you carry honors Jesus as the center point of all reconciliation, the hinge upon which the door between darkness and light swings open for every being in creation." Something shifted in Sariel's expression, a softening that might have been relief or approval, or perhaps simply recognition, an acknowledgement that the message had successfully passed from one guardian to another across the gap of species and experience. "They will not believe you at first. Some will call you mad or deluded. Others will try to suppress what you share because it threatens the boundaries they have drawn around acceptable faith. But there will also be those who hear and recognize truth when it resonates with the deep. Knowing planted in every human soul, the awareness that you were made for more than this single planet, that you are part of a story so vast and beautiful, it makes your scientist's cosmology look like a child's drawing of the actual cathedral," he said. And now he was moving toward the back of the cave, where shadows pooled thick despite the growing dawn light outside. I wanted to follow, to cling to his presence for whatever moments remained, but my feet felt rooted to the stone floor, understanding somehow that this next part was his alone to walk, that my journey and his were diverging here even though they had intersected for this crucial, transformative night. Remember what you saw when I showed you the resurrection wave spreading across dimensions, Sariel called back to me, his form already beginning to blur at the edges, as if he were shifting into a frequency my eyes could not quite track. Remember that there is no corner of creation too dark, no being too lost, no mistake too ancient to be beyond the reach of the love that was demonstrated on the cross and confirmed in the empty tomb. The cave suddenly filled with a sound like wind rushing through infinite corridors, and light began to emanate from the shadows where Sariel stood, not the harsh white glare of human technology, but a golden radiance that seemed to carry warmth and weight and presence. And I understood. I was witnessing the activation of something far beyond any machine humanity had conceived, something that married the material and the divine in ways our crude categories could not accommodate. Through the cave entrance, I heard shouts of alarm as the military forces detected the energy surge, heard equipment malfunctioning and men calling for backup, their voices tight with the kind of fear that comes from encountering phenomena that their training has no protocols for addressing. But I kept my eyes on the light at the cave's rear, watching as it intensified into a pillar that seemed to punch through stone and sky simultaneously, and within that pillar I saw Sariel rising, ascending within a column that matched descriptions I had read in childhood from my grandmother's ancient Bible, the same words used when prophets described angels departing or the glory of the Lord manifesting among his people. The manuscript fragment in my hands pulsed in rhythm with the pillar of light, as if acknowledging its source, and I clutched it to my chest, while tears streamed unchecked down my face, overwhelmed by the terrible beauty of this moment, by the realization that I had been chosen not because I was worthy, but because God's purposes often select the unlikely, the overlooked, the ones whose very improbability serves to demonstrate that the power comes from beyond human capacity. As Sariel's ship breached through into the dawn sky above, the pillar of light visible for miles across the Ethiopian highlands, I fell to my knees one final time, not in despair, but in worship, understanding at last that God's love truly was more vast and more inclusive than I had ever imagined, that Jesus had come as a light, not just for my people, or even just for humanity, but for all creation, and that I had been graced to glimpse that cosmic truth in all its staggering, beautiful immensity. The pillar of light faded into the morning sky like a prayer dissolving into heaven, and I remained on my knees in the cave's entrance, clutching the glowing manuscript fragment, while the sound of military boots grew louder behind me, knowing that in moments I would have to face men with guns and questions I could only partially answer, men who would see threat where I had witnessed holy purpose. But before they reached me, before the ordinary world came crashing back with its demands for explanations that fit inside rational boxes, I allowed myself to simply breathe in this transformed reality, to feel the weight of what Sariel had placed in my hands and in my heart, to understand that I was holding not just ancient parchment, but a key that unlocked doors between worlds that humanity had convinced itself must remain forever separate. The manuscript pulsed gently against my chest, its warmth spreading through my ribs like a second heartbeat, and with that pulse came a clarity that felt less like my own thoughts and more like remembering something I had always known but forgotten, the way you suddenly recall a dream hours after waking and realize it was trying to tell you something crucial about your waking life. I understood then why Ethiopia, why this remote highland cave, why these particular scriptures had been preserved when so many others had been edited or lost or declared heretical by councils of men who thought they were protecting truth, but were sometimes only protecting their own limited understanding of how vast God's plans actually were. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church had guarded the Book of Enoch, had maintained texts that spoke of heavenly watchers and cosmic rebellion, and a salvation story that encompassed more than just human sin and human redemption, had preserved in their ancient liturgies and illuminated manuscripts a vision of Christ that was simultaneously intimate and infinite, personal and universal, the Saviour who knew each sparrow's fall, and also the Lord whose resurrection sent shockwaves across dimensional barriers humans were only beginning to theorize might exist. Behind me, someone shouted for me to raise my hands and move slowly away from the cave, the voice tight with adrenaline and training, and I complied with deliberate calm, tucking the manuscript fragment inside my shirt, where it rested against my skin, still radiating that subtle warmth, still connecting me to everything Sariel had shown me, even as the physical presence of his ship vanished into the stratosphere above, as I emerged fully into the dawn light, blinking. Against the brightness after hours in the cave's dimness, I saw at least 20 soldiers surrounding the entrance, their weapons trained on me with the jittery precision of men who had witnessed something that violated their understanding of what was possible and were compensating with aggression for the fear that violation had sparked in them. An officer approached, a woman with sharp eyes and insignia that marked her as Ethiopian military intelligence, and she studied me with an expression that contained equal parts suspicion and something else, something that might have been wonder, or might have been the faintest trace of recognition, as if some part of her knew that what had just occurred here could not be reduced to the categories of threat assessment she had been trained to apply. "Who are you, and what was that light?" she demanded in Amharic, her weapon lowered, but her posture still coiled with readiness. And I realized this was the moment Sariel had been preparing me for, the first test of whether I could serve as the bridge he had commissioned me to become, whether I could speak truth in a way that built connection rather than simply triggering more fear and defensive closure. I met her eyes and answered in the same language, my voice steady despite my exhaustion. "I am a keeper of a message that your ancestors understood, that the monks who preserved the oldest books of our faith knew in their bones, that God's love is bigger than we have allowed ourselves to believe, and that Jesus came as a light, not just for one nation or one world, but for all creation." Something flickered across the officer's face, a momentary softening that suggested my words had touched something beneath her professional armor, and she glanced back at the cave entrance where morning sun was now illuminating the ancient paintings and star maps on the walls that Sariel had shown me. Revelations that had been hiding in plain sight for centuries, waiting for eyes that could see them properly. "The elders in my grandmother's village used to tell stories," she said, slowly, as if the words were being pulled from some deep place she rarely accessed, about how our churches kept books that Rome rejected, about how our priests knew things about angels and other worlds that the Europeans called superstition. But my grandmother believed those stories were true, believed that Ethiopia was chosen to remember what others were meant to forget. I nodded, feeling the manuscript fragment pulse against my chest, as if confirming her words, and I understood that this woman was not my adversary, but rather another potential keeper of the bridge, someone whose heritage had prepared her, even if her training had tried to override that preparation, with purely materialist explanations of reality. "Your grandmother was right," I said quietly, taking a careful step toward her despite the soldiers tensing around us. "And what happened here tonight was not an invasion or a threat, but a remembering, a reconnection with truths that were always meant to work together, that God who created the laws of physics and the expanses of space is the same God who became flesh in Bethlehem, and that the story of salvation has always been bigger and more beautiful than we dared to imagine, encompassing not just our sins, but the reconciliation of all things, visible and invisible, on earth and across the heavens." She stared at me for a long moment, and I saw her, struggling between her duty to contain and control this situation and some deeper instinct that was urging her to listen. to consider that perhaps her orders were inadequate to the actual significance of what had occurred here. Finally, she lowered her weapon completely and turned to her soldiers, issuing commands in a tone that brooked no argument, telling them to secure the perimeter but not to enter the cave, to document what they had witnessed, but to refrain from disturbing anything inside. And then she turned back to me with an expression that was no longer suspicious, but rather expectant, almost hungry, like someone who has been thirsty without knowing it until water is finally offered. "Tell me what you saw," she said, and it was no longer an interrogation, but an invitation, a genuine question from one Ethiopian to another, from one inheritor of ancient faith to another, and I felt gratitude wash through me that my first telling of this story would be to someone whose cultural and spiritual heritage had prepared her to hear it without immediately dismissing it as madness or delusion. So there, as dawn broke fully over the highlands, and the pillar of light's afterglow still shimmered faintly in the upper atmosphere, I began to speak, pulling the manuscript fragment from my shirt and letting its gentle radiance illuminate the space between us, telling her about Sariel and the centuries he had waited, about the Book of Enoch passages that glowed with validation of realities our ancestors had recorded, about the vision of Christ's birth witnessed from orbit by beings who recognized it as the fulfillment of prophecies written in the stars themselves, about the resurrection wave that had restored balance across dimensions and offered redemption to fallen beings throughout creation, and about how Jesus was not diminished by this cosmic scope, but rather revealed in his full glory as the reconciler of all things, the hinge point between heaven and earth, and all the spaces in between that we were only beginning to understand existed. She listened without interrupting, her eyes moving between my face and the glowing manuscript, and I watched her expression shift from skepticism to wonder, to something like relief, as if I were confirming things she had secretly hoped might be true, but had never heard anyone speak aloud, as if the bridge between faith and cosmos that had been broken in her by years of secular education and military rationalism was being rebuilt right there in the Highland dawn, and she was discovering that she could stand on it without falling, that it was strong enough to hold the weight of both her scientific mind and her believing heart. When I finally returned to my village 3 days later, walking the dusty road that wound through terraced fields where farmers were bringing in the teff harvest, I was no longer the same person who had left to investigate strange lights in the sky. And though my body carried the exhaustion of sleepless nights spent answering questions from military officials and church elders alike, my spirit felt more awake than it had ever been, illuminated from within by truths that had reorganized everything I thought I knew about God's creation. The manuscript fragment remained hidden against my chest, its warmth now familiar as my own pulse, and with each step closer to home, I felt the weight of my calling settling onto my shoulders, not as burden, but as purpose. The way a farmer feels the weight of seed he carries to the field, knowing that what seems heavy now will become harvest if he is faithful to the planting. Children playing near the village well spotted me first and came running with questions about where I had been, their voices bright with curiosity unmarred by the cynicism that age so often brings. And as I knelt to greet them, I saw in their open faces the very reason Sariel had chosen to entrust this message to human hands, because we are the ones who live between earth and heaven, physical and spiritual, the ones who can touch both soil and stars and testify to the God who made them both. My grandmother emerged from her house when you heard the commotion, her ancient eyes finding mine across the dusty square, and I saw in her expression that she somehow knew without being told that I had crossed a threshold, that I had been marked by an encounter with the holy, and she simply nodded once with profound satisfaction, as if something she had been praying for across decades had finally come to pass. That evening, As word spread and villagers gathered in the church courtyard, under a sky brilliant with stars that now felt less like distant lights and more like windows into the vast household of God's creation, I stood before my community, clutching the manuscript and feeling inadequate to the task of translation, knowing that what I had experienced in that cave could not be fully captured in words, but trusting that the same Spirit who had hovered over chaos in the beginning could breathe life into my testimony and carry it into hearts that were ready to receive it. The priest, an old man who had baptized me as an infant and who had studied in the ancient monasteries where the Book of Enoch was still read as scripture, invited me to speak with an expression of such gentle encouragement that I felt my nervousness dissolve into something more like sacred confidence, the knowledge that I was not speaking from my own authority, but as a vessel for a message that was simultaneously ancient and urgent, eternal and timely. I began simply describing the crash site and the being I had freed, and I watched my neighbors' faces shift from skepticism to attention as I showed them the manuscript fragment, and it began to glow in response to their focused witness, as if it recognized faith when faith was present and offered visible confirmation of invisible realities. When I spoke of Sariel's revelation that Jesus was the reconciler not just of human sin, but of cosmic fracture, that his birth was witnessed from worlds beyond our knowing, and his resurrection sent waves of redemption across dimensions we could barely theorize. I saw tears streaming down weathered faces, saw elderly women who had carried their faith through famine and war, nodding with recognition, saw young men who had drifted towards secular doubt, leaning forward with hunger rekindling in their eyes, and I understood that this truth was not foreign to them, but rather the completion of things they had always sensed but never heard articulated, the missing piece that made their inherited faith suddenly snap into focus with new clarity and expansiveness. My grandmother rose then, her voice still strong despite her years, and she began to recite passages from the Book of Enoch in Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language that sounds like prayer, even when speaking of ordinary things, and as her words filled the courtyard I heard in them the validation of everything Sariel had shown me, the textual foundation that had been preserved in this corner of Christianity, precisely so it would be available when humanity was finally ready to understand that God's love cannot be contained within the boundaries of a single planet or even a single dimension. She spoke of the watchers who fell and the watchers who remained faithful, of prophecies concerning the Son of Man who would judge both earth and heaven, of a coming restoration when all things would be reconciled under Christ's lordship, and her voice carried the authority of someone who had never doubted that these ancient words were meant to be taken seriously as descriptions of actual realities rather than dismissed as primitive mythology. When she finished, she walked to where I stood and placed her weathered hand on the manuscript fragment, and the glow intensified until it cast light across the entire gathering, illuminating faces that reflected both the radiance of the object and the deeper radiance of hope being rekindled, faith being expanded, understanding being elevated to embrace mysteries they had permission to wonder about rather than obligation to explain away. The priest raised his hands and began to pray, thanking God for preserving witnesses across centuries, for sending messengers across impossible distances, for loving creation so thoroughly that even fallen beings in distant realms were not beyond the reach of Christ's redemptive work. And his prayer wove together the familiar liturgies we had known since childhood, with the new understanding that those liturgies had always contained more than we realized, had always been singing of a salvation bigger than we had dared to imagine. In the weeks and months that followed, as I traveled to other villages and eventually to the capital city and then beyond, carrying the manuscript and the testimony it validated, I discovered that this message of cosmic Christ and universal reconciliation did not diminish the intimacy of faith, but rather deepened it. Because a God whose love extends across galaxies is no less present in the widow's grief or the child's prayer, but rather more trustworthy, more worthy of complete surrender, more capable of keeping his promises, because his power and compassion operate on scales we cannot exhaust or limit. I met scientists who wept with relief to discover that their faith and their research into the vastness of space could coexist without contradiction. Theologians who felt chains of limited interpretation falling away as they reconsidered ancient texts through this expanded lens, and ordinary believers who simply felt their hearts grow larger as they contemplated a Jesus who was simultaneously their personal Savior and the Lord, before whom every being in every dimension would eventually bow in recognition of his rightful authority. The manuscript fragment remained with me always, its glow a constant reminder that I was not speaking from imagination, but from encounter, that I had been chosen not because I was special, but because I was willing, because I came from a tradition that had kept the old books and the old awareness that reality is thicker and richer and more populated with intelligence and intention than materialism allows. And on clear nights, when I would stand under the stars that now felt less like decorations and more like neighbors, distant but real, I would remember Sariel's final words about being a bridge between heaven and earth and the spaces between, and I would pray that I was faithful to that calling, that my words built connection rather than division, that they drew people toward the Jesus who is big enough to hold all creation in his wounded hands and intimate enough to know each heart's secret. Longing for a love that never ends. What truth has been hidden in plain sight within your own faith tradition, waiting for eyes ready to see it? Subscribe to continue exploring the intersection of ancient wisdom and cosmic revelation.